Good evening. My name is Josh Baer, and I am a recovering former gallerist turned art advisor turned art market journalist who publishes something called the Baer Faxt. When I speak to an audience, before I get started with what I have to say, I like to get a sense of who's in the room so I can try to adjust my issues to you. How many people in this room are artists? Okay. By the way, there are more artists in America than lawyers. It's an interesting census statistic. How many are dealers? Okay. How many are collectors? Okay. How many people are here as the art advisor for Tiger Woods? No. Okay. So that wasn't everybody raising their hand, but it gives me a sense of this. So each year I tend to do a David Letterman type approach of 10 things about something. So this year it's 10 things about buying art. And the first thing that some of you might notice is that a really traditional talk like this would probably say 10 things about collecting art. And I want to have a little sense that that's a little bit of a different take that I'm taking, because everybody sort of is conceiving of themselves as maybe collecting. So keep in mind that I'm talking about buying art. And those of you who have heard me speak before know that I like to make a point right off the bat that we tend to think about or talk or be asked about the art market as if it was one thing. And there is no such thing as the art market. There are many art markets. There's probably one art market for each artist. There's certainly an art market you might generalize about Chinese contemporary art, but does that have anything to do with the market for WPA art? So when people ask about the art market, I think what they really are asking or saying is, well, what about the things I'm interested in? What about, if I'm an artist, what about the market for my work? If I'm a gallerist, how am I doing? If I'm a collector, what about the things that are comparable to what I'm doing? So I really like to shy away in some ways from these, what could be overgeneralizations, because it's really specifics that matter completely in either looking at a work of art or which artist or which magazine or which museum to deal with. So that's a point I always like to start with. And mind you, at the end of my 10 or 11 things, I'm going to open the floor for questions, so hopefully there will be some. Issue number 2 is that not all artworks have the same value. You might have an exhibition that has 10 works that are the same size, the same year, but obviously by the same artist, and the gallery's offering X dollars for each one. So the assumption is that they're all have the same financial value, but they don't, because as soon as the show is over, some of them are probably or maybe worth more, and some of them may be worth less. The gallery always has to price them exactly the same. So they're never making a distinction that, well, all the 4-footers, this one is more in a primary exhibition because it's better. So keep that in mind when you're looking at a show and you're like looking at the price, that one of the key elements is sort of hasn't happened yet as to what something might be worth. Now, another thing that I like to think about is that it's probably a dealer that most of you have heard about named Larry Gagosian, and he told me something interesting once, because I was talking and said something about, oh, this client of yours. He said, I don't have clients, I have customers. And I thought, that was an interesting comment that I don't think any other dealer or gallerist in this fair or any of the fairs would be willing to use that term. And yet he's thinking in that way. And I think, I don't know, it just resonated quite a bit to me. Galleries tend to also overuse and advisors and say, so-and-so is my client. It's like they own them. Now, in some narrow circumstances, there are relationships where a collector works only with one person. But what you need to know in this rule, things about buying art, is that you have the ability and should be able to shop or buy anywhere, that you're not tied down now to any one region, one dealer. Certainly there are advantages for becoming a better customer at the same store. It's like going to the same restaurant over and over. You'll get a better table, you'll get better service. If you tip well, you do well, and the art game is played that way. But you're a customer, and you should be able to shop wherever you want. Now, the flip side of that is there are some rules, and my colleague who spoke before said, when asked about selling art, there are some rules about how you should sell art that are a little different than how you should buy art. Notably that it's considered good form to, if you're trying to sell something, is to offer it back to the person who sold it to you in the first place. But as a buyer, you should be able to buy from London or Nada or anybody, and you should make use of that. Now, another point I'd like to make about buying art is we have two markets that are described as the primary market, which is an artist who's generally a living artist who's represented by a gallery. It comes from the studio, or it comes directly from that artist who's being paid, that being the primary market. And the secondary market, meaning a work that's already been sold at least once and is back for sale for its second, third, 50th time. And art markets are not that efficient. So the primary market and the secondary market value of things are rarely, if ever, the same. So in a climate like we had through September 2008, for successful artists, the secondary market price was generally higher than the primary market price. Galleries were still pretending that they were doing a good job keeping the price down to only 300,000 or only 30,000 or only 3 million, and the secondary market existed for people who couldn't get those works, and they'd be willing to pay more at auction, from other private dealers, from people who bought it. So they weren't equal. Now we have a recession, which may be winding down a little bit, but now the secondary market can often be less expensive than the primary market. The galleries are still insisting on holding to their price points because either they think it's bad form to lower their prices, which I disagree, or the artists are insisting that because they're so much better artists that their work should be more expensive. So that gives an opportunity for people to buy works for less money elsewhere. So those things are always in flux, and there's never a stasis except maybe in the print market where you have every object is always the same. So if you have 100 Warhol prints, they will be the same price everywhere because everybody knows that you can go check things out elsewhere. But so I would say the print and sometimes photography market is an exception, but there's not a balance there, and the balance sort of flipped in the last year and a half. Now, how do we know these things? Well, on the one hand, information is sort of, not just in art, but in everywhere, is this killer thing that we think we know things because we read about it on the internet. So first of all, if it's on the internet, it must be true, which is may or may not be the case. And the other thing is I like to always say that we're over-informed, but we're undereducated. So the information that you might be getting about, and now we're talking about buying art, are comparable prices for things. So people use databases to look at artworks, and it doesn't take into account quality, differentials, condition of artworks being different. So saying that the last Frank Stella sold for X makes you understand the price of this Frank Stella is a little bit misleading. And people who've made their living analyzing data tend to overuse the statistics a little bit. So that extra information, I think, is actually not, it gets in the way quite a bit of people convincing themselves that they know more than they might. Which makes me think, you know, we've often talked about people, how they buy art, and then we made the point, and it was made earlier, that a lot of people seem to buy art with their ears. I think what's happened is that people started to buy art with their brains. And they're into analyzing things, and people, financial people, have made their careers on being able to take information, research it, study it, and they have an intellectual relationship to objects, but they're sometimes missing the aesthetic or the visual or the emotional relationship. So it's not as bad as buying something with your ears, where you're just listening to who's the hot thing or what it should be. But if you're only buying with your brain first, that's another kind of new thing that you just have to pay attention to your own buying and how you're functioning, and you need to sort of learn what process you go through for looking at a work of art. Me personally, I look at the historical value of an object, then I look at the market value, then I look at the aesthetic value. That's how I experience art. Everybody has a different process. My wife looks at the beauty, and then she looks at the form, and then she probably does a few other things, and it's a different process. And we each have our own process, and if you really thought about it, you could probably identify how you go through this, because you have 30 seconds, you're looking at an object and making a decision whether to look at the next object, particularly at an art fair, where there's, you know, if you spent 1 minute in every booth, you'd be here for almost 6 hours. So if you're coming for one day, how can you experience so many objects? So you have to figure out how you're getting information and how you're analyzing it in terms of intellectual versus, I could almost say, academic things. Now, back to some market things. And by the way, again, I want a number of hands of dealers in the room. Okay, so there are 4 of you. 4 of you are going to like this statement. And art advisors? 1. Okay, 5 of you are going to like it. And the rest of you may not like it. The next point I make is kind of like, just shut up. Listen to the people who know what they're talking about. A lot of collectors and art buyers want to talk when they're interacting with looking at objects. And that talking is interfering with actually learning something from people who know more than you do. And you're much better off spending that time either listening or looking. So, you know, keep quiet. There's plenty of time to talk later or do your gossip or whatever, but the dealers aren't really probably learning much from you. You're trying to maybe validate who you are by showing that, you know, this thing relates to that thing, but it's really not very interesting or important. And you can have that internal dialogue, but, you know, like I said, most of you may not like this, but just shut up, okay? Now, if all of you haven't left the room by this point, I'd like to say this. If somebody comes along to you, I don't know how many times this happens to you, but it happens to me when I walk around with my clients, that it seems like every booth I go into has a masterpiece. It's kind of unbelievable that there are so many hundreds of masterpieces in one building. And every gallery sort of has a great deal. This is such a great deal. It's only this much. And I want to think, well, if it's such a great deal, why didn't you buy it yourself? Why are you giving that opportunity to me? And particularly if you're not one of the top 10, 20 X collectors in the world, if somebody is telling you, particularly a more marginal person, that this is the greatest opportunity and they should do this, it's like, my first thought is, well, why don't they buy it themselves? It's like if I just met you and I said, you know, you're a collector, there's this great thing, it's $10,000, it's going to be a masterpiece, it's gonna be worth millions, trust me, why would I be giving it to you? I just met you at cocktails at the Ritz-Carlton yesterday. I'm going to be thinking, self-interested probably, gee, maybe I'll keep that one. So I'd be very dubious for things. People are really trying to push you with this idea of this great deal. I would also, I find it remarkable when I hear about how something, now this is a a gallery, let's say Gagosian Gallery or whatever, it's only $1.3 million when the gallery director is telling me that. And I'm thinking, I wonder how much money you have in the bank. It's like, I think you should use, that's a 4. That's like 4 times my salary, or that one's a 0.3, or that one's a 10. Because other than the gallery owners, none of these people can afford the art that they're telling you is so cheap. So I'm a little bit flabbergasted when I hear those expressions. So, you have to be thinking, most people, that you're buying art with after-tax dollars that you had to earn. And that's a lot of money. And it's a lot easier than somebody's telling you it's only $50,000, but, that's still a lot of money. And you should use the same rigorous principle for buying, I think, any work of art at any value. The same discipline of going in, well, let me pull that back. You can do that. I'll talk about art as an investment in a second, but it's good to use the same rigor to make every decision, whether it's for $5,000 or $5 million. Unless you're an addicted shopper, which some people who collect art are. Now, I would postulate that art is, usually it's a bad investment. Now, we read about these great stories, but most people don't keep score very accurately. So they tell you about some work that they bought for $10,000 that's worth $200,000 now, but they don't tell you about the other 19 that they bought for $10,000 that's sitting in the closet. So they don't like to tell about their failures. So scorekeeping in collector world is not usually very good. And even if you were to do a pure financial analysis of how you spent money, it usually doesn't come out that well, even in the greatest hits. It's not quite as good as buying Microsoft the first day or buying Berkshire Hathaway stock the first day. And it tends to be a worse investment than people think. Now, that depends if that brings to mind whether you're buying art or collecting art or investing in art. If you buy it because you love it and you can afford it and you're happy to have it forever, that's a pretty good standard that you can't get screwed by. That's, I like that theory at a certain point. It's like, if no one likes it and I still like it, I'm happy, how can it go wrong? Now, there comes a point for everybody where there's a sum of money where that equation changes. For some people, it's $10,000. For some people, it's $1 million. For some people, it's $100 million, where they say, well, what about the worst case? I could never conceive of the Dow Jones going down to 6,000 from 13,000. But if it did, what would I be able to do? Could I sell this object for some cost? So there is a point there where, for each of you, there might be an issue. What if? And that's a valid question to just feel like you're comfortable, because if you keep that in mind, that can help you make some decisions about whether or not to buy something, as to sort of the worst case scenario, because we all know we like to judge things by the best case scenario. Now, within that, I'd say that art is enormously easier to buy than it is to sell. And it seems like, in the last few years, it wasn't the case. And that was a simple time when everybody was a genius. So everybody who bought art, it was worth more. Kind of like all the geniuses who bought condos in Miami and Miami Beach. So when one was worth more, 10 had to be better, or maybe even whole buildings, because after all, I am a genius. And buying it was easy. Selling it is really a very difficult thing, and that's why dealers get such a high percentage of what what they get, whether from the artist of 40 or 50%, or 5 or 10% or 20% from private clients. Their auction houses get 25%. It's a very hard thing to do. So I would say if you're a private collector and you're thinking about becoming dealers, and mind you, many of the best dealers were collectors at one point or are also collectors, you know, be careful, because you run the risk of no longer enjoying what may be one of the greatest pleasures you have, which is buying and living with art. If you turn it into a business, there's a very good chance that you may become a little bit jaded or be a little less interested in what you're doing. Now, one other thing about buying art that I like to think of, buying art is kind of like buying a new car. You know, when you buy a new car and it's great and you drive it like 20 feet off the lot, you've lost what, about 17, 20% in the first 10 feet? It's not a very good use of money in that way, is it? You know, I would tell you to buy a slightly used car, but buying art's the same thing. As soon as you bought it, you're down 10 or 20%. As soon as the check has gone out of your hands or the wire transfer has gone through, you're in a negative equity situation. You're underwater with your artwork because there's a transactional cost that you would have to go through to get your money back. So, you know, I always thought it'd be great to have an art fair in Las Vegas because you could sell a work of art to somebody for, say, $100,000. They go to the casino that night, they lose a bunch of money, they come back the next day, you give them 80, then they take their 80, they go back to the casino, they win some money back, then they come back and they give you 100, they can go back and forth. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity, Vegas, for dealers to play that game, because what I think the economic term is the elasticity of art, is there's these transaction costs. So that's also why you have to be a little bit careful. I'm gonna make one more point, which is sort of number 11 before I take questions, is that buying art, I think, is an act of faith. When you buy a refrigerator, it's pretty clear what something, why GE is versus Sears versus Maytag. There's really an act of faith is, why is this worth 18,000? Why not 17? Why not 19? Why not 20? And the dealers will always tell you, oh, 19 would be too much, and 17 would be too low, and 18, that's the right price. But there is no right price. It's completely an act of faith of going and buying art, because there's no real intrinsic value. It's just, there's supply and demand, but there is no intrinsic value. So you're operating from truly faith. And I think that's a wonderful thing about buying art, is that you're injecting faith into a cultural endeavor. So those are my 10 or 11 points. So I open it up to questions if there are any.
In the very beginning, you listed some steps in the process that you go through mentally when you evaluate a piece of artwork. And you said first comes its historic value, what you perceive as its historic value. Then next was market value, and then aesthetic value. Can you differentiate historic value from aesthetic value? Can you elaborate on that difference?
Well, for me, when something was made matters. So personally, I'm not interested in any abstract art by somebody who started making abstract art after 1975. Because I think all the historical avant-garde of what's been achieved in abstract art had already happened, until somebody comes up with something that proves me wrong, had happened. So I think it may be aesthetic and it may be nice. For me, it has nothing to do with the history of art. It's not going to be in the books. I'm not so inclined. That's my way of looking at things.
Hi. It's just a simple thing, because I want to hear something about the human side of the collector. I am very involved with the artwork, but I want to go further than this point. So when you say that your wife, when you choose a piece of art, look for the beauty, the form, describe me, please, the moment that you buy an art piece and then emotionally, more than the typical considerations, how it is when you have time, when you are not angry, for example, when you
Well-
are in your mood.
Well, I'm the only one probably in this building who basically doesn't collect art or want to collect art. I was raised by artists, so for me, art was made and it left. I'm interested in supporting art. Sometimes I buy art as my job, as a private art dealer occasionally, or to make money. So I don't choose to live that way. I think where it would intersect is when history, market, beauty intersects beauty, history, market, and they all come up plus, plus, plus for my wife and me. That would be a win if we were buying things together. We just hang things that she happens to own or like, but I have no interest in it myself. Hang on.
I'm a huge fan of your newsletter, but I had, have you ever had any, I guess, issues with the privacy considerations of the things that you publish, and also how do you validate some of that information?
Well, because I'm also an art advisor, I choose my art advisory in relationships with my suppliers and contacts first. So I'm going to tell you, for your $200 a year for 55 issues, I'm choosing that side of my business first over something that I might or might not put in my newsletter. So I'm going to be upfront with that. Then I'm going to think about my relationships, and I'll know that people, particularly private people, want their privacy respected. So sometimes I'll consider that. I'll consider how much I like the person. I'm just telling you the truth, and how I make this decision. I make the decision based on whether I'm the first to write about something. Then I make the decision about, is it good for the community to talk about what's going on? And there are a lot of processes, but it's really, pretty direct.
I wasn't sure if I heard you right earlier when you said that art is not like the stock market, but at the same time, you're in a position where you're an advisor, the same as a brokerage firm. And therefore, especially now, if you're buying for an investment, it becomes the same as real estate because you can do a 1031 on it. When you're buying for your own aesthetics and for your own self, a whole different points go into it. How do you react to that statement?
I think you have to be clear about what your intentions are when you're buying it. Your stockbroker will tell you not to fall in love with shares of stock. And as it's dropping, that you love it, may be time to get out. So if you're buying art as an investment, don't confuse it with art that you're buying because you love. And if you're buying art because you love it, don't get confused with it as an investment. So if you're really buying to invest in it, and technically if you're doing 1031 exchanges, they want you to be saying that's why you were buying it, that no one obeys that rule, that it was purely as an investment, then treat it as such the same way. But people get confused between the two. And when you do that, you can get in trouble. You don't sell it when you should as an investment because now you've decided you've liked it. So in fact, you're paying a lot more money for it than you would have. Or you decide that, gee, it's good, somebody should have it, that they haven't offered me enough money, I'm not selling. Just be honest with yourself for which you're doing with that object. But people tend not to. Somebody who hadn't asked, then I'll come back.
You mentioned that art databases aren't the best way for people to educate themselves on how to buy a piece of art and the pricing of it. But besides listening to dealers and people who know about the art world, and I mean, as you mentioned before, how would you suggest people educate themselves on how to buy a piece of art and the price of it.
I don't say, I just trying to make the point it's not the only way. People tend to look at it as the only way. You know, I would say, you know, these databases are about auctions. I would say make sure you go look at the works in the auction. So if you're walking around and you happen to be interested in an artist and you have a catalog, make a note that says, wow, that has a huge crack right down the middle of it. Maybe it didn't sell so well because it had a water stain across a third of it and been folded. Now, or to make subjective views about the quality. So it's part of the equation, but it's not the entire part. I use it every day, so it's a good tool, but it's, you know, it can't replace other research.
Can you say why you order your priorities in particular way that
I
you
just
do?
realized that's what I do. So I, you know, was teaching once. I wondered about how we did it, and I did as an experiment with my class, and I asked everybody to write down how they in fact look at an object, because when you go look at an object, we each have a way we process it. There's this square or something on the wall. What is your brain doing? And I just happened to think about it and try to identify how I do it, and asked other people a little bit, and I think you've got one. You just, if you thought about it, you know what yours is 95% of the time.
So you're not suggesting that it's an absolute
I'm just saying it's the
hierarchy,
way I
just
do
how
it.
you do it.
And that's why I said my wife does it completely oppositely. And, you know, I'm going to stick to first to new questioners.
This is a very broad question, so answer it any way you'd like. What are your thoughts on fairs like this?
Fairs like this are they're great for information gathering. They're great opportunities to ask questions, because if you come up to Chelsea, all these guys are behind closed doors and they don't want to take your question, and the receptionist is too busy, you know, shopping online to like say hello to you. So it's a great opportunity to, like, you know, find out something. I think if you're, you know, I have two groups of collectors I work with. People who are just starting, who have nothing and don't know much. This is a great place to try to find things for them at the beginning, at whatever price level. Then I have some clients who have 30 years worth of collecting. This is a hard place to find something that's as good as the things they bought over 30 years of doing it. And then my goal there is just find one thing. So it works. There's something for everybody, from newbie to old pro to, you know, it gives you a sense of what you might be interested in as information of how to go further. I think one last question before I have to catch my plane.
Sure. Can you speak to the value of prints? And for those of us who are just starting out and wanting to collect some of the more established artists, but those are out of reach, can you speak to the value or the ignorance in terms of investing in prints?
A great print is better than a bad drawing, and a great drawing is better than a bad painting of the same artist. So I think prints were obviously the entry point that got lost when photography became considered more fine art than pure photography. I would pay attention to, you know, for me, for instance, Jasper Johns is the greatest printmaker of the last 50 years. So I keep that in mind. It's certainly an easier thing to grow out of as you have more resources, to have more distribution, to be able to then trade up or trade out. But, you know, there's also, when you're looking at prints, you really need to pay attention to the apps. I don't really care about a tear in a bend in the corner of a painting, but if there's a bend in the corner of that print, you have to know it compared to the same print that's in Boston and Frankfurt and London and 100 other places. So it becomes a little bit anal about condition. And I'm not, me personally, that way. It's like people who collect photography and vintage photography, that there's 1 millimeter foxing on there. Doesn't matter to me, but to a pure photography collector it does, and to a pure print collector it's supposed to. Me, I care more about, what was it I said, the historical something? Yeah, that stuff. Okay. Thank you very much for coming.